Hey Earthkeepers, I have a friend, Leah Kostamo, who has taught me a lot about the power of nature to heal. You might remember her talking with us about this way back in episode 5 in season 1. For years, she has offered spiritual guidance in the context of her work with an organization called Arasha Canada. More recently, Leah has been building her mental health counseling practice. So in the spirit of the Earthkeeper season 5 theme of greening all vocations, I thought it would be interesting to touch base with her again to hear about the ways that she as a therapist is learning to collaborate with the healing power of nature. Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast. Leah, my friend, it's so good to be with you again. It's been 4 years since you've been on the podcast. In fact, you were one of our first guests in season 1. Thank you for that. But obviously, in all that time, there have been some changes in your life, and maybe you can catch us up a bit.
Yeah. So since then, I've gone on to do a master's in counseling. So my work has been split between Arasha, which is a Christian environmental organization, where I do mostly spiritual care now, and then meeting with clients one-on-one for clinical counseling and everything from depression to anxiety to trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wonder if you could maybe catch us up on Arasha as well. I mean, obviously some of our listeners know what Arasha is, and many of them have connections to it, but tell us what Arasha is in general, and then maybe talk about specifically what that looks like in the British Columbia context.
Yeah. So Arasha started back in the 80s in Portugal, a couple, Peter and Miranda Harris. First, it was kind of like a bird observatory kind of research place, and then it spread all over the world. It's in over 20 countries, working primarily in conservation, whether that's habitat restoration or species preservation and study, and then environmental education. That's kind of all over the world. And then where we are, we have also added sustainable agriculture. So we have a center, we have a couple centers or 3 centers actually in Canada, but the one in BC that I'm most affiliated with is like a 27-acre property. It has heritage status, so it's beautiful old buildings. There's over 30 people that live on site, plus young people who come to learn and be trained in either farming or conservation or education. So it has a lot of impact in those 3 areas. It's kind of like, I don't know, sometimes I think we're trying to do everything, like approaching conservation from every angle. But it's that living together in community as a way of having enough kind of hope and encouragement to do the hard work of earthkeeping together.
Well, one of the core values of Arasha, of course, is their stance that we as Christ followers are called to care for creation, to love creation, and that in itself just makes the organization so unique and distinct. I wonder if you could talk about that. Like, in your view, what difference does that even make to say we are Christians in conservation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one is, so much of doing something hard is meaning making. Why are we doing this? And I think the shared meaning of, like, as Christians, that God is invested in the earth through the incarnation, that God becomes creation, and that God is holding creation in love, through the Spirit, so that it's more of a joining in with God than a panic. Although I think panic is appropriate sometimes. Like, I don't like the everything's going to be okay, just trust God. Yeah. 'Cause horrible things happen. But there is more of a sense of, perhaps, I know lovely Buddhists who work with joy, so I'm not saying over and against other traditions, but within the Christian faith, this idea that Jesus shared in our createdness, both as creator and creature. And then having that as a way of alleviating our own sense of doom. And maybe it's appropriate to have some doom that we're joining in. I'm saying the same thing like 3 times, but joining in with God in the work that God's already started. Yeah.
Yeah, and the weird, sad, ironic thing is that even though those truths are central to the gospel, really, to Christian faith, they aren't values that are practiced, much less respected in so much of the church. We've lost that vision, right? It's just not part of the way we see life or our purpose as Christ followers.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does Arasha come up against that much, just in terms of maybe the resistance to the message that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think early on, very much so. Like when I say early on, and Canada's history. So this is like 23 years ago when we would go to churches to speak. People just, it's like we had 3 heads or something. It's like, what are you talking about? I remember one time I was at a booth after the service, like trying to peddle our propaganda. And this woman, finally, nobody was coming up to talk to me. I'm just standing there like, what are we doing here? Finally, a woman comes up and I'm like, oh, thank God, somebody sympathetic to the cause. And she came up and she goes, I just wanted to ask, where'd you get your shoes?
Oh, no.
And I was like, what? So that wasn't antagonistic, although the first Christian conference we tried to be a part of, they said, no, you're not really a Christian mission. You can't be part of our Christian mission conference because you're doing something not Christian by doing environmental work. But that same conference, 20 years later, we were invited to be, we've been led workshops and children's groups and had one of our board members be a plenary speaker. So there has been a shift and also a backlash, I think, especially in the States, but Canada has that same, where there's this wedding of politics and church in a way that lumps the environment or the environmental cause, quote unquote, into a particular political camp. Then we find like, whoa, there's not much room for conversation here. But we've seen more like the church, quote unquote, as a whole, becoming much more like awake to this issue and the centrality of it to faith.
Yeah, and I would say that Arasha, and in particular, Peter and Miranda Harris, had a lot to do with that, right?
Yeah.
To making that an acceptable idea, something that Christ followers could actually consider as a new understanding of our reality, of our world. I know for me, taking a class with them up at Regent College in seminary was just transformative because they were telling me that, that creation care, that seeing God revealed in creation was all core to the Christian experience. It wasn't peripheral. And I knew that on some level. I recognized that as truth, but I'd had that perspective taught out of me by so many years in the evangelical church. So in a way, it was sad that I kind of lost all those years, but it was also just such a freeing experience to sit under their teaching. And of course, it's led to where I am today, just really invested in so much of environmental advocacy work. But you were in that class with me, that very first class. Right. I'm wondering what was Arasha's role in your transformation and your changing of perspective that gets you to where you are right now?
Yeah. In that class, I'm sure you felt this way too. It was, first of all, so it's not necessarily Arasha as a whole, but Peter and Miranda Harris, their winsomeness, they're just, it didn't hurt that they had these beautiful English accents.
Right.
Miranda was very much a fairy godmother type personality. So first it was just being seen. First it was just like, oh, I'm accepted. I feel I belong. These people make me feel like I belong. And then it was like, oh yeah, this, like you, was something really important to me because I grew up going to Orcas Island where our neighbors were an ornithologist and biologist, husband and wife. So my early years were very much like on forest trails, in kayaks, on the water, very much like the natural world was my playground, my first love. And then through campus ministries that were very evangelical, that really was suspect. Like I actually told one of my campus leaders in this ministry when she was asking, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, a marine biologist. And she was like, oh, yeah, not a great choice for a Christian, like missionary, not pastor, because I was a woman. So but basically, that's your option. Yeah. So coming into that world with them, and then Lauren and Mary Ruth Wilkinson before them, was like, oh, it kind of felt like coming home. It was like, oh, I get to wed my love for God and my love for creation that was almost frowned upon for a while, or just seen as not important. It was like, no, these both get to exist together because they're part of a whole. It's not one or the other. Yeah. So it was huge. It was gigantic.
Yeah, for me as well.
Yeah.
Well, you have transitioned over the years in your work with Russia, and now you're doing more spiritual guidance and healing, I would say, if that's an accurate description. Describe your work as it is now. Like, what do you do day to day?
Yeah, so I'm actually only at Arasha 1 day a week now, and that's new. I was, 4 days a week, 3 days a week, 2 days a week. Now I'm 1 day a week. Yeah, so I did a program in spiritual direction. So I meet with folks one-on-one, and then I also lead retreats. And so it's really whatever people bring. So it could be relational heartache. It could be like my prayer life is dry. It could be I'm freaked out about climate change. Could be all number of things. And I sit with them and listen, and hopefully we hold together. Where's God in all of this? How are you feeling sustained? Yeah, so I wouldn't say I don't like the word direction, actually, spiritual direction. I like the word spiritual companionship. So I companion them in their spiritual journey as they hold hard things.
Yeah. Well, I would imagine that with your core values, whatever you do, whether it's counseling or whether it's spiritual direction, leading retreats, I'm sure that you pursue that always with an ecological sensibility. Is that true? If so, what does that actually look like in your work?
Yeah, that's a question I'm answering because retreats, it's super easy because I'm leading them at an Arasha center. And I really believe I don't need to change anybody's mind about anything. I just have to, it's like I lay a simple table with some ritual, like some morning prayers, midday, evening prayers, some sharing time, some shared liturgy. But then basically I give them a little packet of, here's some things you can do outside, some prayer exercises, some different, basically like lie on the grass and look at the clouds for an hour kind of activities. Be present to your life and to creation and God holding creation and in creation. So I feel like I'm speaking about my retreats in particular, but super light on dogma and teaching. Oh, there might be like 15 minutes of teaching, and very spacious in go experience God in creation for yourself. And then that is healing. That reorients people. We have an end of the day sharing time. And I remember one time this guy came. There was only one man and it was all women. And this was years ago. And he, this is important, he was a hydrologist as a profession. And we're all sharing about the assignment was to go and just look at something in creation for like a half hour straight and not go immediately to like, oh, this tree is so big. It reminds me of the power of God, to stay with the tree and just be like, oh, it's brown. Oh, it's rough, like really be with this creation as a fellow creature. So anyways, the hydrologist came back. He starts talking about how he sat on the bridge and he just watched the water flow under the bridge. And as he's talking about the beauty of the water and almost stuff he couldn't put into words, he starts crying and like tears are coming down his face. And he says, I feel like I saw water for the first time. This is a hydrologist.
Right.
Like, what? And that's why I love setting people loose in creation. Because it's like, I could tell them, be anxious for nothing, But if they don't consider the birds and the lilies, it's just an idea not to be anxious. It's like creation and somehow the Spirit of God in creation works on them to reduce their anxiety or to give them hope or whatever they need, or to just let them know they're not alone. They're a creature amongst other creatures held by the Creator. Yeah, that doesn't answer your question about one-on-one or,
No, it does. Yeah. Yeah. I'll ask you another question. I mean, obviously you in some ways collaborate with creation, collaborate with nature in your work. And I would say, as you're maybe trying to encourage or nurture personal wholeness or healing, you really obviously have this assumption that nature heals. Right. I'm just wondering what in all of your studies and experiences have you discovered about the deep power of nature to transform and restore people?
Yeah, it's so funny. When you asked that question, I got the chills. Because I think that's how much I believe that's
absolutely. Yeah.
It's like, yes, you speak truth, brother. I remember reading years ago, and it's really an old book now. It's called Your Brain on Nature. There was that whole thing, your brain on drugs, like your brain on nature. And it really is just a whole book full of studies, clinical studies on what happens when people are outside. And that one of the ones that sticks with me is there was this study on people who had gallbladder surgery. This was a Pennsylvania hospital, and they measured the amount of pain meds and then the length of stay after the surgery for half the patients recovering on the side of the building that had a view of a brick wall, and the other half the patients had a view of a forest. And the people with the view of the forest got better faster and used less pain meds than the people with the view of the brick wall. And other studies, like even about having houseplants around you, and ADHD. I mean, it was so convincing. And then I recently read a study, it was out of Stanford, they were measuring altruism. And in the study, somebody dropped a bunch of pencils on the ground, and it's like, will people stop and help me pick up these pencils? So like, will people be altruistic? So in one place, they dropped the pencils on like this kind of street, not necessarily busy is a sidewalk, but it's like surrounded by buildings. And then the other one, they dropped the pencils on this path next to a forest. There's a forest nearby. More people stopped to help them pick up the pencils if they were close to nature. I mean, just stuff like that. You can't even explain it. Like, why are people nicer in nature? And why does our stress go down? I mean, there's answers about negative ions, and like there's like chemical, neurological things that happen. But then there's also, it's hard to explain. I don't know if it's evolutionary, like it's in our genes, like to calm down when we have a view of a horizon, because it means we're safe. It means there's no predator. We can see far. There's all these things that I don't know what's happening inside us. I just know that for example, I'm meeting with clients and they're anxious. I'm like, can you go outside? Is there a park near you? there's a lot of things I advise them to do, but that's one.
Well, however you explain it, I think it certainly raises the question of connectedness versus disconnectedness. I mean, I think people are becoming more aware of disconnectedness to the natural world. And that's a good thing. And I think it's obviously something that you help people to do, is to reconnect. In fact, when you say that book, Your Brain on Nature, is old, makes me think it's time for a new book, Leah Kostamo. I think you need to think about that. I think you have probably a lot of new stories to tell. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, just put a pin in that. How do you talk about relationship to creation in your work? How do you talk about the dynamics of relationship with people?
Yeah. Are you meaning specifically in spiritual direction or in counseling?
I think both, either.
Well, it's funny because, like, if I'm talking to, I'll use this as a metaphor, which is just coming to me, so I might not like how I answer this. Sometimes when somebody's dating somebody or somebody's in a marriage and they come to the counselor and they're like, "Oh, I'm in crisis. I don't know if I should stay with this person," and I say, "Well, what do you feel in your body? What does your nervous system do? Do you feel at home? Do you feel like you settle with them? Do you feel like you can be your whole self with them? Or do you have to like really manage yourself so that whatever, they don't explode or, and I think the same, if you go and apply that to creation, of course, there's places that are devastated. There's places in creation that don't feel like home, like the middle of the Sahara Desert for people who grew up in the Northwest of North America. But like our own home place that we grew up knowing, like being oriented to through play as children. So you can only play if you feel safe. So when children play outside, they are like oriented to the safety of the trees around them, the grass, all these things. So I think as adults, this has been a place where their body settles, where they feel at home, where they feel they can be socially connected to other people and to their environment. So they can use it as a way to, I'm getting off your topic of the relatedness. I mean, now I kind of want to go the whole Robin Wall Kimmerer, like kinship route. I'm regretting my answer a little bit. But I'm just talking individual nervous system. Like, where do you come home to yourself so that you can be in that place of safety to play with, to have social connection with other people, to like relate to the trees, the grass, the plants, the vegetables you're growing, in a way that's not under threat, like not from a place of like threat or consumption, but just like now going towards kinship. Like, because I think that's what happens in human relationships. It's like, oh yeah, we're kin. Okay, this is hard, but I feel at home. Yeah. Do you feel at home? Let's make our home together. And I think I'm stretching this metaphor, but
no, I appreciate the fact that you're willing to do generative thinking right on the spot here. I think that's where new ideas come from. In fact, I'll tell you that as I listen to you, there's this kind of meta message in the background that I'm playing with, and that is the idea that creation care is self-care.
Yeah.
That self-care is creation care. That because we are part of creation, there aren't those hard boundaries between the two.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Do you find that in your own life first?
Oh, gosh. Yes. But I have to say that I often forget it. Right. Again, it's just we've not been taught with that as a central truth, many of us, and it certainly includes me. So it's a discipline to return to that idea and then to do the work of self-care, contextualized in broader creation care narrative, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you about counseling specifically. As you train to be a therapist, do you get any sense that psychology as a field might be moving toward a deeper understanding of the power of nature to heal? Why, in your view, might such a shift be important?
I think on two levels that it is happening. I think on one level, just this whole new emphasis in psychology on somatic practices and somatic modalities. And soma just means body in Greek. So from somatic experiencing with Peter Levine and ways that like our nervous system holds trauma and how to heal that and discharge that and come back into regulation. So I think that's honoring creation because that's our body. Our body is creation. So I think on that level, psychology is going in that direction. And then there are increasingly more programs and folks doing work in the like nature therapy realm. One of the people that I think of particularly is a guy named Bill Plotkin, who runs, it's called the Animas Valley Institute in Colorado. And they have, this is a really extensive training program. It's like a 6-year, it's Jungian depth psychology meets nature mashup. And it's all things like, I've done one of the retreats and it was beautiful and wonderful, but it's a lot of time just, they call them wanders, like some teaching. And then you just go wander on the land and sit for like 3 hours. And there's a structure to it and instructions and everything. And then there's up in my neck of the woods, there's a place called Human Nature Training Program. And then the human nature has a little leaf on it. So I love the little play on words there. And interestingly, and this is just anecdotally, like I know a person who went to one of these therapists as part of this collective. And I was like, well, what are you doing? Is it different? Like, are you lifting up a rock and just staring at it with your therapist? Or what? And she was like, no, we're just kind of doing regular talk therapy, but we're sitting on the beach. And I was like, oh, okay. So it's not always like something new or different. It's just like, I think this would go better if we were outside. And of course, it depends. It works well for talk therapy. A lot of the therapy I do is like eyes closed, more somatic, inward, which if you're in a more public place, that feels so vulnerable and it's not a safe enough container. Somebody might walk by and it's like you feel self-conscious because your eyes are closed and you don't know where they are. So it depends what modality you're using. But this idea that nature as it's not even a backdrop. It's like a co-therapist with the therapist. Like, because if it's at the beach, the negative ions off the water are reducing cortisol levels. Seeing the horizon line is reducing cortisol levels. The aromatic chemicals from the trees that are being emitted are reducing cortisol and adrenaline level. Like there's all physiological things that are happening. In addition to these, person-to-person relational healing and then insights that it can be healing, that all these things are working together. Yeah.
I like that idea of moving the therapeutic talk, let's say, into a context where nature is more present, more accessible.
Yeah.
Because it's transitional in a way, I think, in the sense that I think if one were to do that enough, maybe one would realize that nature is always there as healer, right? And so healing isn't always something that has to be mediated by a professional therapist. That we can always go to creation for healing if we learn how to connect in those ways, how to access that power that underlies all creation. Does that threaten your job?
No, I think please everyone go.
Right. And it's free.
And it's free. It's like, right. What is the low-hanging fruit here in your life? Move your body, go into get sleep, eat well, talk to friends. Like if you did those things,
But it strikes me that we really do need guides, right? I mean, people,
Yeah.
it's a lost art, it's a lost awareness, and we absolutely need guides to take us into those places, to help us to learn,
Yeah.
to listen, to receive, to connect again. So I appreciate the work you're doing, and I really think in some ways, in the realm of psychology, it's pretty cutting edge. I don't see a lot of that happening, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I do recommend looking up Animas Valley Institute.
Okay.
They
Yeah.
have retreats all over the world,
Uh-huh.
and they literally rent a campsite. Like they don't have retreat centers. They're just like national park for a week. And these highly trained guides create this container for you and then send you out again and again into nature to process the deepest stuff in your life, like your deepest wounds, and kind of alone with nature, and then back together as a group as you share. But it's a fascinating model. Yeah.
Well, speaking of pain and healing and grief, as a parent of a young adult, I have to say it causes me so much grief to witness a sense of hopelessness about our climate future in my daughter and her friends, her generation. She's 21, just graduated from school, but she struggles with what I think many will call climate despair. And for some of her friends, that means, it gets expressed as anger. For others, maybe most, I would say it translates more to a sort of passive acceptance, a retreat from facing the crisis and the crises to come. I'm just wondering, as parents, how have you and your husband encountered these issues and your kids? And how have you actually attempted to walk with younger folks in their struggles?
Yeah, I want to say first, not as well as I'd like to. I feel like I've learned from my kids. Both my kids are activists and participate in protests, not just climate things, but more political things, and advocating and befriending and being befriended by unhoused people. And so first off is I'm learning from my kids more than I think I'm offering. I feel like I'm standing still and they're running ahead on a lot of things, and they are I'm not saying this like even glibly, like they are the next generation and our teachers. I mean, I firmly believe that about my kids. We had this with our residents, these young people who come to be trained at the Rasha Center. I remember once we had a panel discussion, and it was on hope, and a number of the people in their 20s who had come was because they were in despair, and they were like, how do I live my life? Like, should I just eat, drink, and be merry, and fly as much as I can and have a good time, because we're going to be extinct, and, everything's going to be a disaster soon. And so and this is maybe more where I am in my own like deconstruction phase, is I used to be like Colossians 1, like everything redeemed in Christ, which I still believe, but also I'm like, I don't know if hope, I think there is a nuance to hope that is like just a sense of hope that's almost beyond the attachment. I mean, this gets into union and that, also Ignatian spirituality of this, like, well, kind of all spirituality actually, of letting go, like to the results. Like, are we clinging to it's all going to keep looking like this and then we're going to be happy? Or are we opening our hands and like, this is going to look really different? It's already looking different. Can I release my attachment to and my panic about like, oh my gosh, it's not going to look like what I want it to look like? And can I then move into both some action? Because action is always an antidote to anxiety. Anxiety is like sitting in a rocking chair and feeling like you're going somewhere, but really you're just sitting still ruminating on the problem. And action like gets you out of the rocking chair and has you taking a step towards something productive. So I'm all like, plant a tree, do go to a protest, like do something, but the acquiescence only increases the anxiety, even if you're not looking at it. And then some sort of spiritual practice that I think has to include creation. It has to include what you're sad about, like what you're sad about losing. Like it has to include some lament, some solace, because the trees are still here. Well, not the ones that are burning up, but there are still trees. There are still birds, even though we've lost, 50% in the last 40 years of the global bird population. And letting your body be consoled by birdsong, by the view of the trees, by the view of it's just so basic. It's so not intellectual. It's just so literally like, look at the horizon line and then go do something practical.
I don't, something is coming to mind that I learned actually just after college. Someone introduced me to a traditional Indian concept called Nishkamakama. And the way it was explained to me was, it was the principle of doing your duty to what you know is true. And in the case of maybe Christ followers, do your duty to know what God asks of you without focusing on the results, right? You simply do what is right, do what you're made to do, because I think if you focus too much on the results, that can lead to despair, right? Because we know deep down that we're not going to change the world with whatever we do. But the point, I think, is not so much changing the world or forget it, but rather simply do the thing you're meant to do what you can do, and try to stay present in that. What do you think about that?
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. I think that's it. I think that's the way of hope. Because hope doesn't have to be we're going to save it all.
Right.
That's the only reason I'm doing all this. Yeah. Because of that. But it's a releasing into this is my calling. Yeah. My calling.
Yeah. I personally have a troubled relationship with that word hope. I hardly ever use it anymore because the way people tend to use it, which is, yes, things will get better. We believe. But, I think hope is instead just acting, right? Yeah. And releasing responsibility in some ways for the end results.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, there's a great book by Joanna Macy, who's an environmental activist. Used to be a activist against nuclear stuff. I think she's still alive. She must be 90. But anyways, her book, which I bought in the middle of the night because I was up in despair and anxiety around the climate crisis. Her book is called Active Hope. And that's that point she makes is that the opposite of hope is apathy. It's actually not despair.
Yeah, that's such a good point.
To be hope has to have some feet on it and be doing something that is right. That is this is what I'm called to do. Yeah. But it includes lament, and it includes to just trying to create a world that you want to live in, even if you don't know if it will happen.
You started your answer to my question about your kids by saying that you learn from them. And I think that is a really critical idea. This idea that we actually need to listen before we try to fix, if we try to fix at all. And it comes to mind because I just spent some time with dear friends from college days. And one of my friends is having such a hard time understanding his son, who is very much in that place of stark realism about the future, right? And I think my friend's response is to want to downplay that, right? To downplay the despair, probably out of love. He wants his son to feel better and to have hope. And so I think, his temptation, I think, is to say, well, people have always said this about the world. They've always been doomsayers. But I think if there were a way for him to truly listen and receive and connect with his son's pain, he might understand that it's not actually despair. It's just a realistic perspective of the world that leads him to make choices, his son, that he wouldn't make himself, I suppose. Just he doesn't live in that same place, that same perspective.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, there are undoubtedly many people listening to this conversation wondering, what do I do with these ideas? What would you say maybe to those who might really be longing, say, for a deeper connection to creation, or people who want to learn to find healing and restoration in their relationship to creation? What actionable recommendations might we offer them?
Yeah, I feel like this is, I'm going for the low-hanging fruit. It's, you don't have to sign up for a big, long retreat. You just have to start a practice, which probably everybody listening to this podcast does because they've tuned in to something called earthkeeping. But as you said, it's easy to forget. Like this morning before our time together, I was like, okay, I could look over force questions or I could go for a walk in the woods. I think I'll go for a walk in the woods. But even as I walked in the woods, because there's some hard things in my life, I realized I was ruminating. I was just looking at the past, and really my attention was on these thoughts and fixing a problem. And I'm like, oh yeah. I look up, I'm like, oh my gosh, this beautiful little ravine right here.
Right.
So it's not just going outside, but this is the whole, practice of mindfulness. It's like, where are you? Pay attention, take it in without judgment. Don't be too quick to analyze. And especially if people are Christ followers, there is this knee-jerk response I find, especially in evangelicals, to make like analogies really fast, like, as I said before, that tree is like the power of God. And it's like, well, that's fine, but that's an idea. That's not an encounter. So John O'Donohue talks about this idea of landscapes as either a place we journey through or landscapes as a place that we encounter and are changed by. And so that does require a slowing down. When I realized that this morning, of course, I know I was going to be on this podcast. So I was like, I got to walk the walk or walk the talk. So in this case, it was walking more slowly because I realized I'm totally ruminating. I'm not really even noticing the trees. So I slowed down, and I just took slower steps so that I didn't have to watch my feet, so that I could look around and look at the trees. And that is healing. I took deeper breaths. I connected with my body more because of that. It's not one or the other. I think the main thing is it's just not ideas. It's encounter. So some practice of encounter, whether that's sitting in your backyard and looking at the bird feeder or finding a park, a place to walk. The more it's like unmitigated by a window, I think is good. Because you can't smell creation through a window. Like having your sense, really being a creature in your senses in creation, I think.
And really, I think, at the core of any practice is a discipline of attending, discipline of being present.
Yeah.
And it is really hard work most of the time to be present, to be attentive.
Yeah.
And I have found that, as I've try to help other people, but also in myself, my own practices, that it's really important to have grace for myself because I'm learning this way that is really a way of unlearning, of what it means to be anywhere, about what's important, about what things are prioritized. So I really think it is a discipline that one has to learn and that one will get better over time. But initially, our minds are going to wander. We're going to be staring straight down, thinking about other things rather than looking around us to see God revealed everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And we ebb and flow. Even the practiced forest walkers lose their attention. Not that I'm the most practiced forest walker, but yeah, that's the grace is like, wow, this must be a really big problem I'm thinking about because I've really lost my ability to attend to creation around me, and then have grace and then attend.
Yeah, I have to admit that I do sometimes get nervous when I talk about my own experiences of forest walking or recommend that to other people because not everyone has access, right?
Yeah.
So many people live in situations where forest walking is not really an option. Like, what do we say to those people?
Yeah, as I was saying, sit in your backyard and look at birds. Even as I said that, I was like, so many people don't have backyards. Why am I using that example? Yeah, it depends. Like if you're in the middle of Manila, like it is going to be hard to find. I just think I feel sad. I almost like don't know what to say. I mean, of course, there are some birds somewhere. Hopefully there's a park somewhere, but it takes maybe an hour through traffic to get there. And then you've dysregulated your nervous system going there and back. If they're in North America or Europe or more rural places in South America or Africa, there are parks. There are places you can get to. There are trees in a neighborhood, even if you live in an apartment or you have a tiny little balcony where you could plant some basil. So, they've done those studies on like who the creatures that live in Tokyo, or at least major cities, and it's like coyotes. And I don't know if it's coyotes in Tokyo, but we had a black bear. I live in a total residential area. There was a black bear the other day. Like, there's never been a black bear here. Not that I wanted to encounter him, but I think creation, I mean, obviously people are creation, so we can always encounter people, but there is creation all around us. And we can also make choices if we have the means to have a holiday, which not everybody does. But you can choose to like be in creation for your holiday. Like my big holiday for this year was doing one of the Animas Valley Institute camping things. So I was sleeping in a tent. There were porta potties. It was not luxurious, but it was like, woo, full immersion in creation. And it was like, I needed that medicine. I also wanted a more comfortable bed and a nicer bathroom. There's things about it that I didn't love. But I think sometimes we're like, oh, I don't have a big property, or I don't live next to a safe forest trail. Like that's another thing for women. People who consider themselves female to walk alone in a forest is a privilege that men have more than women in a lot of places. So you have to, I just want to be humble about, it's not so easy. I live in the Pacific Northwest where there's Douglas firs all around me and paths all over the place. And lots of people don't have that.
Yeah. Well, I've met people actually who have confronted that issue head on and have made it their work to provide opportunities for people in urban contexts, right? Whether it's through helping a community to create a garden together, or whether it's actually finding resources to maybe take inner city youth out into encounters with nature, which I know you have done before, that kind of work. But I think that's maybe also part of creation care, right? Is making ways for people to encounter creation in those ways and encounter God in those ways.
Yeah. I don't know if you're familiar with Ross Gay and his work. He's a writer. He wrote the Book of Delights. He has an interview with Krista Tippett on being, and he's also a professor of literature. He was also a college football player. And he's an interesting fellow, but he helped start a community garden in his neighborhood. And it's in a neighborhood that, it's basically an abandoned lot. But it has become this place of gathering and community and nature with all the little creatures, ladybugs and, raccoons that walk through and everything. And yeah, it doesn't have to be this huge national park. Like literally a corner lot.
I'm going to run something by you. I mean, it's not a new idea, but it's sort of new in the moment for me. Maybe that's the work of the church. I mean, we talk a lot about, the church should in some ways mediate God to people, right? We interpret the word of God to people, right? But maybe also the job of the church is to mediate nature, right? To find ways for people to sense, know God, understand experientially God's revelation in nature. What do you think about that?
I think yes, please.
Yeah.
That's it. I mean, early on in Russia, Canada, we had a gal, Queenie, who her main job was working with churches to do community gardens. So it was kind of that, but the angle, interestingly, was more like serve your neighbor by growing good food for them.
Right.
It was more like the Good Samaritan rather than, Gerard Manley Hopkins, like the glory of God, for all this nature is never spent and let's go out and observe the resurrection all around us all the time. Yeah, I mean, could you imagine if churches were like these beautiful wild places where it was like, I need some time in nature. I think I'll
go to church.
There's a yard around it, or I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, somebody told me the other day that the biggest landowner in the whole world is the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
And I have a friend up here who's working with churches. She's part of the land back movement to Indigenous people. And she's specifically working with churches, dying churches, to instead of selling their property and just giving it back to the denomination, to give the property like right over the deed basically to the local Indigenous folk whose land it was in the first place. That's an aside, but yeah, I just think that would be so prophetic and beautiful that people, instead of needing to go to a national park or just even the local park, thought of going to a church, even if they didn't want to go inside. It's just like, oh, I want to go sit in that place, in that garden. That would be so beautiful.
Yeah, the church's garden.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Very Revelation. It's both a Genesis and Revelation. Yeah.
Thank you, Leah.
Yeah.
This has been good.
Yeah.
I actually love it that you think out loud, even on a podcast. That's great, right? It ultimately makes things just so much more interesting. And I think we end up in places that are just really interesting too, to both of us. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your thoughtful questions that come from your own lived experience of this whole, making sense of being a creature in creation and how to help Christians in particular live out a more wholesome, in all sense of the word, gospel faith.
We've been in conversation with my friend Leah Kostamo about her spiritual guidance work with the Russia and about her work as a co-therapist in collaboration with the healing power of nature. For more information about her work, please go to the show notes for this episode. And remember, you can also view this conversation at youtube.com/@circlewood, or navigate first to the general YouTube site and search for us using our handle, which is @circlewood. That is &sign followed by the word Circlewood. The Earth Keepers podcast is an expression of Circlewood, an organization committed to cultivating a more ecologically conscious faith. For more information about the podcast or to learn about the ways you can support this work, go to our website at earthkeepers.online. You can contact us by leaving a voicemail through the podcast website or by emailing us at earthkeepers@circlewood.online. I am Forrest Inslee, your podcast host. James Amadon is our executive producer. Our content editor and researcher is Colleen Megerly, and our sound engineer is Dave Wolfers. Jesselyn Gentry is our social media director, and Forrest Reed is the composer of our original music. Thank you for listening, friends, and please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.